The air in Aethelgard did not smell like air. It smelled like processed oxygen and the sterile, metallic tang of a laboratory that had been scrubbed with bleach one too many times. I stepped off the transport shuttle, my heavy tactical boots clanking against the translucent floor. Beneath my feet, I could see the swirling white mists of a gas giant, thousands of kilometers below the orbital shell. It was a long way to fall for a gardener from the slums of Neo-Jakarta. "Keep moving, human," a voice crackled beside me. I looked up at the guard. He was an Etherean, nearly 7 feet tall, with skin that looked like polished opal and eyes that glowed with a faint, irritating violet light. He held a pulse rifle like it was a holy relic, and I was the dirt that threatened to smudge it. I didn't say anything. I've learned long ago that when you're a grade B citizen in a grade S galaxy, your mouth only gets you into rooms you can't get out of. I adjusted the strap of my weathered kit bag. Inside were the only things that mattered: 3 rusted trowels, a bag of heirloom seeds from a planet that no longer existed, and a pair of pruning shears that had belonged to my grandfather. To the Etherians, I was a primitive. To me, they were just people who had forgotten how to get their fingernails dirty. The great spire of Aethelgard rose before me, a jagged needle of white stone and living crystal that pierced the very center of the Dyson Shell. This was the seat of the matriarch, the heart of a civilization that claimed to have perfected the union of biology and technology. But as I walked through the grand corridors, I saw the truth in the corners. The moss growing on the pillars was turning a sickly gray. The flowering vines that lined the arches were brittle, their leaves curling into blackened husks. Aethelgard was dying, and they were too proud to admit their high-tech sensors couldn't find the soul of the problem. "The matriarch will see you now," the guard said, stopping before a massive set of amber doors. "Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not touch anything, and for the love of the eternal light, try not to smell so organic." I cracked a dry smile. "I'll do my best to stop existing, pal." The doors hissed open. The throne room was a cathedral of light. At the far end sat Matriarch Valerius. She was draped in silks that shimmered like a solar flare, her crystalline skin so pale it was almost blue. Beside her stood a man in sharp geometric robes, Prime Harmonizer Kalen. He looked at me like I was a cockroach that had somehow learned to walk upright. "Cassian Vane," the matriarch spoke. Her voice was like wind chimes in a gale. Beautiful, but sharp enough to draw blood. "The specialist from the Terrasol territories. You come highly recommended by the Biosalvage Guild." "I just grow things, Your Majesty," I said, keeping my voice level. I didn't bow. My knees were too stiff from years of working in gravity wells for that kind of theater. "You grow things where life has been forgotten," Kalen interrupted, his voice dripping with condescension. "Aethelgard is not a mud pit. Our Resonance Arboretum is the most sophisticated biological computer in the quadrant. It regulates our atmosphere, our power, our very lives, and for 12 cycles, it has been failing." "Maybe it's tired of being a computer," I muttered. Kalen's eyes flared violet. "It is an instrument, and like all instruments, it must be tuned. But we have a more pressing concern. My ward, the Princess Lyrol, is the biological key to the Arboretum. As the garden fails, she fades." "Fades?" I asked. "Silence," the matriarch said, her expression softening for a fraction of a second. "For 12 years she has not spoken. Not a word, not a cry. The healers say her vocal cords are intact. Her neural pathways are clear, yet she is a ghost in her own home. If she does not speak, she cannot interface with the Arboretum's core. And if the core dies, Aethelgard falls." I looked around at the pristine, cold beauty of the palace. It was a cage of glass and gold. I'd seen this before. On the mining colonies, we called it the squeeze, when the pressure of what people expect you to be becomes so heavy, you just stop trying to be anything at all. "So you want me to fix the garden and make the girl talk," I said. "That's a lot of weight for a guy with a shovel." "You will be given 48 hours to show progress," Kalen said, stepping forward. "If the Arboretum does not respond to your primitive methods, you will be escorted to the airlock. Do you understand the stakes, human?" "I've worked in oxygen-deprived tunnels with nothing but a hand pump, Harmonizer," I said, meeting his gaze. "I understand stakes just fine." "Take him to the Eastern Quadrant. the matriarch commanded, and send Lyral. Perhaps the sight of someone so different will stir something in her. The guard led me away, deeper into the bowels of the spire. We passed through 3 security checkpoints, each more invasive than the last. Finally, we reached a heavy seal marked with the symbol of a blooming flower entwined with a gear. "The Resonance Arboretum," the guard announced, his voice hushed. "The princess is already inside. Don't get too close to her. She's delicate." The seal slid back, and I stepped into another world. It was a disaster. The Arboretum was a massive dome, 300 meters high, filled with tiers of what should have been lush, vibrant life. Instead, it looked like a graveyard. Great siren leaf trees, which were supposed to sing when the wind hit them, stood silent and gray. The cortex vines that acted as data cables were tangled and frayed, sparking with blue static. The air was heavy with the smell of rot and ozone. In the center of the mess, sitting on a bench made of white bonewood, was a girl. She wore a simple dress of woven silver fiber. Her hair was a shock of pale white, falling over shoulders that seemed too thin for the crown she would one day wear. She was looking at a withered flower in her hand, a lumina rose that had lost its glow. She didn't look up when I approached. She didn't move when my heavy boots crunched on the dead leaves. She was a statue of grief in a dying forest. I didn't try to talk to her, not yet. I knew better. Instead, I walked to the nearest irrigation pipe, knelt in the gray dust, and put my ear to the metal. "You're thirsty, aren't you?" I whispered to the ground. I heard a small movement behind me. I didn't turn around. I just pulled out my trowel and began to dig, clearing away the calcified minerals that were choking the root intake. "They keep trying to feed you digital signals," I said, talking to the dirt but knowing she was listening. "But you don't want data. You want minerals. You want the stuff that makes life messy." I worked for 20 minutes, ignoring the princess, ignoring the guards watching from the catwalks above. I cleared the first valve, and a trickle of nutrient-rich water began to flow. The sound of it, a soft, rhythmic glug-glug, was the first sign of health I'd seen in this place. I stood up, wiping the sweat from my brow with the back of a dirty hand. That's when I saw her. She was standing 5 feet away, her wide, luminescent eyes fixed on my hands. She wasn't looking at my face. She was looking at the mud under my fingernails. To her, it must have looked like a foreign language. "Hello," I said gently. "I'm Case. I'm the new guy in charge of the dirt." She stared at me. Her lips were pressed together in a firm, straight line. There was no fear in her eyes, only a profound, exhausting curiosity. "You're the princess, right? Lyral?" She didn't nod. She didn't move. She just watched. "Solid," I said, turning back to my kit. "I like quiet. My sister was quiet too. Sometimes the world is just too loud to bother adding to the noise, you know?" I pulled out a small glass vial of earth soil, real, nitrogen-rich loam I'd smuggled past 3 sectors of customs. I poured a handful of it into the base of the lumina rose she had been holding. "This is home," I whispered. "At least, what's left of it." I felt a presence beside me. Lyral had knelt down in the dust, her silver dress staining gray. She reached out a trembling finger and touched the dark, moist earth I'd just poured out. Her skin met the soil, and for the first time in 12 years, the Princess of Aethelgard didn't look like a statue. She looked like a girl who had finally found something real. The second day in the Arboretum was worse than the first. The Prime Harmonizer had decided that my manual labor was taking too long and had sent in a team of bio-drones, metallic spiders that scuttled over the trees, injecting synthetic stimulants into the trunks. "Get those tin cans out of here," I yelled at the supervisor on the catwalk. "They are optimizing the growth cycle, human," the Etherian shouted back. "We have a schedule to keep." "You're not optimizing anything. You're giving the trees a heart attack." I watched as one of the drones pierced a delicate aura fern. The plant shivered, its leaves turning a frantic neon purple before curling into ash. The drone didn't care. No, it just moved to the next one, its sensors blinking with cold red light. Lyral was there, as she had been since dawn. She was standing near a cluster of whisper reeds, her hands clenched at her sides. Every time a drone made a high-pitched whirring sound, she winced. She wasn't just watching the garden die, she was feeling it. Hey, I said, walking over to her. I kept my voice low, below the frequency of the drones. Ignore them. They think everything can be fixed with a reboot. But you and I know better, don't we? She looked at me, her eyes reflecting the dying light of the dome. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired you get from a long day of work, but the kind that comes from carrying a secret for over a decade. I sat down on a pile of mulch and patted the spot next to me. Take a load off, princess. You're making me nervous standing there like a decorative pillar. To my surprise, she sat. She did it with a grace I could never hope to mimic, her movements fluid and silent. We sat there for a long time, watching the drones do their damage. They told me you haven't spoken in 12 years, I said, leaning back against a gray trunk. That's a long time to keep your thoughts to yourself. My sister Lily, she went quiet for 3 years. On the colony ships, they called it void shock. The doctors wanted to chip her brain, to force the words out. They said she was broken. Lyryl's head snapped toward me. Her eyes narrowed, a spark of recognition flickering in the violet depths. I didn't let them, I continued, looking up at the artificial stars in the dome's ceiling. I told them if she didn't want to talk to a world that was trying to kill her, that was her right. She started drawing instead. Thousands of pictures of flowers. She said the flowers understood her better than the people did. Lyryl reached into a small pouch at her waist and pulled out a piece of translucent slate. She tapped it, and a holographic image appeared. It was a drawing, not a technical schematic, but a swirling, chaotic mess of lines and colors that looked like a storm caught in a bottle. Is that how it feels? I asked. Like a storm? She looked at the drawing, then back at me. She didn't nod, but the tension in her shoulders dropped an inch. I'm not here to fix you, Lyryl, I said, and I meant it. I'm here to fix the garden. If you want to help, great. If you want to sit there and be silent, that's fine too. I've got enough talk for both of us. My CO used to say I could argue with a bulkhead until it apologized. A small, almost invisible twitch appeared at the corner of her mouth. It wasn't a smile, not yet, but it was a ghost of one. I stood up and grabbed my heavy shears. All right, enough heart-to-hearts. We've got work to do. See those cortex vines over there? The ones that are glowing that angry red? They're clogged with feedback loops. I need to prune the dead connections, but I can't do it alone. I need someone to tell me which ones are still breathing. I held out a pair of sensory gloves to her. They were human tech, old and battered, but they were tuned to pick up biological vibrations. You feel the garden, don't you? You know which parts are actually alive and which ones are just ghosts. She looked at the gloves like they were alien artifacts. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the fabric. Then slowly she slid them on. We spent the next 4 hours in a strange, rhythmic dance. I would move to a vine, and she would place her gloved hand on the bark. If she felt a pulse, she would give a sharp, quick nod. If it was dead, she would hold her hand flat. No words, no resonance pulses, just two people working in the dirt. As we worked, the atmosphere in the arboretum began to shift. The heavy, oppressive silence was replaced by a low, melodic hum. It wasn't the singing of the trees, not yet, but it was the sound of the garden beginning to breathe again. By the time the artificial sun began to dim, we had cleared an entire tier. My hands were blistered and my back was screaming, but the gray moss was starting to show hints of green. Not bad for a primitive and a silent princess, I grunted, wiping the sweat from my eyes. Lyryl was standing near a siren leaf sapling we had just rescued. She was touching one of its silver leaves, her eyes closed. Suddenly, a shadow fell over us. Progress report! Kalen's voice boomed from the entrance. He marched toward us, flanked by 4 guards. He looked at the cleared tier, his eyes scanning the green shoots with suspicion. You have cleared the blockages, Kalen noted, his voice flat. But the princess has still not interfaced with the core. The atmosphere in the lower sectors is still dropping. This is insufficient, Vane. It's been 2 days, Kalen, I snapped. You can't rush biology. These plants need time to recover from your optimization. We do not have time. Kalen stepped toward Lyryl, his hand reaching for her shoulder. Lyryl, the council has authorized the use of the neural bridge. If you will not speak willingly, we will extract the harmonics we need. Lyryl flinched, stepping back behind me. It was a small movement, but it spoke volumes. She wasn't just silent, she was terrified of him. Stay back, I said, stepping between them. My hand went instinctively to the heavy wrench on my belt. She's not a piece of hardware you can just plug a cable into. You forget your place, human, Kaelin hissed. She is the future of Aethelgard. You are a temporary laborer. Guards, remove him from the arboretum. He has had his chance. The guards stepped forward, their rifles humming with energy. I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, the fight-or-flight reflex that had kept me alive in the tunnels of Mars. I wasn't going to leave her. Not again. Not like Lily. But before the guards could reach me, a sound echoed through the dome. It was a low, vibrating hum. It didn't come from the machines or the drones. It came from the air itself. The siren leaf sapling Lyral was touching began to glow. A soft, radiant blue light spread from her fingertips into the leaves, then down into the roots. The humming grew louder, a haunting, beautiful melody that resonated in my very bones. Kaelin froze. The guards stopped in their tracks. Lyral opened her eyes. They weren't just violet anymore. They were burning with the white-hot light of a dying star. She looked at Kaelin, her lips parting for the first time in 12 years. The sound that came out wasn't a scream. It wasn't a cry. It was a single perfect note that shattered every piece of glass in the arboretum. Radiant, she whispered. The word was barely a breath, but in the sudden, ringing silence that followed, it sounded like thunder. Kaelin fell to his knees, his hands over his ears. The drones on the catwalk sparked and died, falling like heavy rain into the bushes below. Lyral looked at me, her chest heaving, the light in her eyes fading back to a soft purple. She looked terrified of what she had just done. I didn't move. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, my heart hammering against my ribs, realizing that the silent princess wasn't a problem to be solved. She was a weapon they had been trying to trigger for 12 years, and I had just handed her the key. Well, I said, my voice shaking just a little, I guess that counts as progress. Lyral didn't answer. She just looked at her hands, then at the glowing tree, and for the first time she smiled. It was a small, broken thing, but it was the most beautiful thing I'd seen in this entire godforsaken galaxy. The matriarch and her council would be here soon. Kaelin would want answers. The galaxy would want to know why the girl who couldn't speak had just brought the most sophisticated computer in the universe to its knees with a single word. But as I looked at Lyral, I knew one thing for sure. The gardener was done taking orders. The ringing in my ears felt like a swarm of angry hornets. The air was thick with the dust of shattered crystal, swirling in the blue light of the dying sapling. For a few heartbeats, the only sound in the entire arboretum was the rhythmic hiss of my own breathing through my teeth. I stood over Lyral, my hands still gripping the heavy iron wrench like a life preserver. Across the debris, Prime Harmonizer Kaelin was struggling to find his feet. His geometric robes were shredded, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He looked at the girl behind me, then at the smoking wreckage of the drones. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was terrified. That was the thing about these high and mighty Etherean types. They loved order until the chaos decided to bite back. "Sitrep, human!" a guard yelled from the balcony above. He was fumbling with a pulse rifle that had clearly lost its power cell. "The sitrep is that your toys are junk and the floor is sharp," I shouted back. "Keep your distance if you want to keep your skin." I turned slowly to look at Lyral. She was still kneeling, her small hands pressed against the silver leaves of the sapling. The white-hot glow in her eyes had faded to a dull, pulsing violet, but the air around her was still vibrating with static. I could feel the hair on my arms standing up. She looked at me, her expression a mix of exhaustion and a strange, terrifying clarity. She had spoken. One word. One single, god-awful word that had just turned this entire orbital shell into a tinderbox. "Easy, kid," I whispered, lowering the wrench. "Just breathe. You're okay. Nobody's plugging anything into your head today." She didn't nod. She didn't cry. She just leaned her forehead against the glowing bark and let out a long, shaky breath. The heavy amber doors at the far end of the dome groaned and slid open. Matriarch Valerius entered, flanked by a dozen heavily armed soldiers. She didn't look at the wreckage. She didn't look at the guards. Her eyes were locked on her daughter. There was a look on her face I'd seen on mothers back in the Jakarta slums when a building collapsed. A desperate, clawing need to find something alive in the rubble. "Lyral," she breathed. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried across the silent forest like a bell. Kalen managed to stand up, brushing the crystal dust from his shoulders with shaking hands. Your Majesty, the human, he has triggered a resonance event. Look at the systems. Look at the arboretum. He pointed a trembling finger at the holographic display screens that lined the perimeter. They were no longer showing graphs of oxygen levels or nutrient cycles. They were flashing bright, jagged lines of crimson and gold. Symbols I didn't recognize, ancient Etherian scripts, were scrolling across the air at speeds the eye couldn't follow. Sector 7 defense grids are online, one of the guards reported, his voice cracking. The orbital cannons have turned toward the sun. The core is reaching critical harmony. She didn't trigger a resonance event, I growled, stepping forward so the matriarch had to look at me. She spoke. She's a 17-year-old girl who finally got tired of being poked by needles and spiders. You want to talk about harmony? Try treating her like a person instead of a circuit board. Kalen's eyes flared with violet light. You have no idea what you've done, ground pounder. That word, radiant, is not a simple expression. It is a bioacoustic command. The Arboretum isn't just a garden, you idiot. It is a weapon, a planetary-scale acoustic cannon, and Lyral is the only living key that can arm it. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a man. I looked back at the girl. She looked so small sitting there in the dirt. A weapon. Of course, in this galaxy, nobody built a beautiful garden just for the sake of flowers. Everything had to have a trigger. Everything had to be a way to kill someone else before they killed you. Is this true? I asked, looking directly at the matriarch. Valerius closed her eyes. Her crystalline skin seemed to dim, the blue veins pulsing slowly. Aethelgard was built in the shadow of the Great War Cassian. We are a people of peace, but peace requires a shield. The Arboretum was designed to protect the Dyson Shell from the Voidwalkers. It was intended that the royal bloodline would maintain the harmony. But when Lyral fell silent 12 years ago, we thought the shield was lost forever. So you didn't want her to talk so you could hear her voice, I said, the bitterness rising in my throat like bile. You wanted her to talk so she could point the guns. It was for our survival, Kalen snapped. Without the resonance, we are defenseless. Do you think the other empires will leave a Dyson shell untouched if they know the cannons are silent? We have been living on borrowed time. And now, thanks to your meddling, the weapon is armed, but it is unstable. If she doesn't complete the sequence, the entire Arboretum will tear itself apart. I looked at the glowing sapling. The blue light was spreading through the roots, moving like a slow-motion fire toward the center of the dome. If Kalen was right, we were sitting on a bomb that was currently singing a lullaby before it blew us all into the gas giant below. I walked back to Lyral. I didn't care about the guards or the cannons. I knelt in the dirt beside her, ignoring the way the static hummed against my skin. Hey, I said. Kid, look at me. She slowly raised her head. The violet in her eyes was deep, like the ocean at midnight. I know you can hear me. I know you understand every word. These people, they want you to be a key. They want you to be the trigger for a nightmare. But that's not why you spoke, was it? You didn't say that word because of the cannons. She reached out and grabbed my sleeve. Her grip was surprisingly strong. She pointed a shaking finger at the Lumina rose I had planted in the earth soil earlier that morning. It wasn't gray anymore. It was glowing with a soft, steady white light, its petals opening wide to drink in the blue resonance of the dome. Beautiful, she whispered again. Her voice was clearer this time. It wasn't a command. It was a statement of fact. She wasn't looking at the defense grids or the soldiers. She was looking at a single flower that had found a way to live in a dying world. You see that, Kalen? I looked over my shoulder. She's not arming your weapon. She's feeding the garden. The trees aren't turning into cannons. They're turning into trees again. Impossible, Kalen shouted. He rushed toward a control pedestal, his hands flying over the holographic keys. The energy readings are off the charts. The resonance is too high for a biological entity to sustain. She will burn out her neural pathways. We must intervene. Don't you touch her, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. I stood up, the wrench heavy in my hand. You've spent 12 years trying to fix something that wasn't broken. You were so busy looking for a trigger that you forgot to look for a daughter. She's not burning out. She's waking up." The matriarch stepped forward, pushing past Kaelin. She knelt in the dirt, regardless of her shimmering silks. She looked at Lyril, and for the first time, I saw the queen disappear and the mother return. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and brushed a lock of white hair from Lyril's face. "My daughter," she whispered. "I am so sorry. I was so afraid of the dark that I forgot how to see the light." Lyril didn't say anything, but she leaned her head into her mother's hand. The blue glow from the sapling softened, turning into a gentle rhythmic pulse that matched the girl's breathing. On the screens, the red warnings began to fade. The orbital cannons didn't fire. The defense grids didn't collapse, they just waited. Kaelin stood by the pedestal, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and confusion. He had lost his weapon, he had lost his control, and for a man like him, that was worse than death. "This is not over, human," he spat at me. "You think you've won? You've just turned our greatest defense into a common flower bed. The Council will hear of this. They will not allow a primitive from Earth to dictate the security of Aethelgard." "Tell them whatever you want, Harmonizer," I said, turning back to my plants. "But while you're talking, I've got some weeding to do. This garden has been neglected for too long." The guards hesitated, looking to the matriarch. She didn't look back at them. She was still holding her daughter, the two of them framed by the glowing flora of a world that was finally learning how to breathe again. Valerius gave a small, weary wave of her hand. "Leave us," she commanded, "all of you, except for the gardener." Kaelin looked like he wanted to say more, but the set of the matriarch's jaw told him the conversation was over. He turned on his heel and strode out of the dome, his robes snapping like a whip. The guards followed, their heavy boots fading into the distance. The arboretum went quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the sterile, dead silence of a tomb. It was the peaceful, expectant quiet of a forest at dawn. I sat back down on my pile of mulch and let out a breath I'd been holding since I stepped off the shuttle. My hands were shaking. My head was pounding. I looked at the little Lumina rose and felt a strange, hollow ache in my chest. I'd saved the girl, but I'd also seen the guns. And in my experience, once people know where the guns are hidden, they never stop trying to find a way to fire them. "Case?" I looked up. Lyril was watching me. She wasn't glowing anymore, but she looked more alive than any Etherean I'd ever met. She pointed at my kit bag, then at the gray dying trees in the distance. "More?" she asked. I smiled, a real one this time. "Yeah, kid, a lot more. We've got about 3,000 levels of this place to fix, and I'm pretty sure most of it is held together by spit and prayer. You ready to get your hands dirty?" She didn't answer with words. She just reached down, picked up a handful of my earth soil, and began to spread it carefully around the roots of the nearest tree. We worked in silence for the next 2 hours. The matriarch stayed with us for a while, just watching, before she had to return to the palace to deal with the political firestorm Kaelin was undoubtedly starting. She thanked me before she left, not with gold or titles, but with a simple nod that said she understood exactly what I'd risked. As the artificial sun reached its lowest point, casting long, violet shadows across the tiers, I looked at Lyril. She was humming. It was a low, melodic sound, the same song my sister Lily used to sing when we were hiding in the cargo holds of the colony ships. I felt a lump in my throat. I'd come to Aethelgard because I needed the credits and I had nowhere else to go. I'd stayed because I couldn't walk away from a girl who was drowning in a sea of crystal. But as I watched her work, I realized that I wasn't just saving her. For the first time in 10 years, I wasn't just a soldier or a scavenger or a failure. I was a gardener. And in a galaxy full of weapons, maybe that was the most dangerous thing of all to be. "Case," Lyril said, stopping her work. She looked toward the darkened corners of the dome, where the shadows seemed a bit too thick, a bit too still. "They are watching?" I narrowed my eyes, looking into the darkness. I didn't see anything, but my gut, the one that had survived 3 tours in the belt, started screaming. "Who's watching, kid?" She touched her throat, her eyes wide. "The shadows. They have eyes of glass. They hear the roots." I stood up slowly, reaching for my wrench. "Stay behind me. We're going to find out exactly what kind of harmony Kalen is really practicing. The lights of the arboretum didn't just dim at night. They shifted into a spectrum that was supposed to mimic the bioluminescence of the Etherian homeworld. The entire dome turned a deep, bruised indigo. The trees began to pulse with a faint, rhythmic neon green, like the slow heartbeat of a sleeping giant. It was beautiful, but to a guy like me, it was a nightmare. In the dark, every shadow is a potential threat, and every rustle of a leaf sounds like a knife being drawn. "Keep your head on a swivel, Lyrol," I whispered. I'd slipped into my old habits without even thinking about it. My back was straight, my eyes were scanning the perimeter, and my grip on the wrench was white-knuckled. "Where did you see them?" She didn't point. Instead, she closed her eyes and tilted her head, as if she were listening to a conversation happening 100 meters away. "Not with eyes, Case. With the pulse. Small. Cold. They hide in the siren leaf bark." I walked toward the nearest tree, a massive specimen whose branches reached up toward the second tier. I took out a small tactical flashlight from my belt, the kind with a focused beam that could cut through a sandstorm, and flicked it on. I scanned the trunk. At first I saw nothing but the iridescent scales of the bark, but then, right at the junction of two major branches, I saw it, a tiny metallic glint. It was no larger than a fingernail, perfectly camouflaged to match the texture of the tree. "Well, I'll be a gearhead's uncle," I muttered. I reached up and pried the object loose with the tip of my knife. It was a microsensor, shaped like a beetle, with 6 delicate legs that had been bored directly into the tree's neural network. It had a tiny glass lens for an eye and a microtransmitter that was currently pulsing with a faint blue light. "What is it?" Lyrol asked, stepping closer. "It's a bug," I said, "and not the kind that eats leaves. This is high-end surveillance tech, military grade. It's not just watching us, it's listening to the vibrations in the trees. It's recording every word you say, every breath you take, and every frequency the garden puts out." I crushed the device under my boot. "I'm guessing Kalen didn't mention he'd turned the royal garden into a wiretapped interrogation room?" "There are hundreds," Lyrol said softly. She looked around the vast dome, her face pale in the indigo light. "In the roots, in the water pipes, in the air. They have been here since the silence began." The weight of it hit me then. For 12 years, this girl had been living in a goldfish bowl. Every moment of her struggle, every tear she'd shed in private, every silent prayer she'd offered up to the stars, it had all been recorded, analyzed, and filed away by Kalen and his harmonizers. They hadn't just been trying to fix her. They'd been studying her like a lab rat. "Those bastards," I growled. "They didn't just want the weapon. They wanted to own the key." "Case," Lyrol touched my arm. "There is more. Below. The garden has a basement, a place where the roots go to die." She led me toward the center of the dome, past the great pillar that housed the arboretum's core. We reached a maintenance hatch hidden beneath a thick layer of cortex vines. It was marked with a Class 5 security seal, the kind that required a genetic key to open. Lyrol didn't use a key. She simply placed her hand on the seal and hummed a single, low note. The metal groaned, the violet light of the seal turning green, and the hatch hissed open. "I thought you said you couldn't interface with the tech," I said, impressed despite myself. "I cannot talk to their machines," she said, descending into the dark hole. "But the machines are made of my ancestors' bones. They remember my voice." The air in the sub-level was freezing. It smelled of old grease and something else. Something sweet and sickly, like rotting fruit. I clicked my flashlight on, the beam cutting through the darkness, to reveal a forest of a different kind. Here the roots of the arboretum weren't growing in soil. They were encased in glass tubes, suspended in a glowing blue fluid. But they weren't healthy. They were covered in black, bulbous growths that looked like tumors. Cables were plugged into every root, leading back to a central processor that was hummed with a frantic, buzzing energy. "What is this place?" I whispered. "The echo chamber," Lyrol said. She walked toward one of the glass tubes, her hand hovering over the glass. "This is where they process the noise. Everything the Arboretum hears from the galaxy is brought here. The secrets of other worlds, the whispers of the Voidwalkers. They used the garden as a giant ear case, and my silence was the only thing that kept the ear from becoming a mouth. I looked at the black growths on the roots. I realized then what they were. They weren't tumors. They were data packets, compressed information that was being forcibly stored in the living tissue of the plants. The Etherians were using the arboretum as a massive biological hard drive, and the siren leaf trees were literally dying under the weight of the galaxy's secrets. They weren't trying to make you talk so you could fire the cannons, I said, the horror of it finally dawning on me. They wanted you to talk so you could broadcast. You're not a trigger, Lyral. You're a transmitter. If you speak the right harmonics, you can send all this corrupted data directly into the minds of your enemies. You're not a weapon that shoots beams. You're a weapon that shoots madness. Lyral nodded slowly. Kalen calls it the symphony of truth. He thinks that by sharing the pain of the galaxy, he can end all wars. But the garden cannot hold so much darkness. It is screaming, Case. Can you hear it? I closed my eyes. I tried to listen past the hum of the processor and the hiss of the pipes. And then I felt it, a low, agonizing thrumming in the soles of my feet. It was the sound of a billion voices crying out at once, a tidal wave of grief and anger and fear that was trapped in the roots of the trees. It was FUBAR, totally, completely beyond repair. We have to shut it down, I said, opening my eyes. We have to purge the data. If we purge it, the Arboretum dies, Lyral said, and Aethelgard with it. The life support systems are tied to the core. If the garden stops breathing, everyone on this shell dies within 3 hours. There is always a catch, I muttered. I kicked a piece of discarded conduit. So we're stuck. If you talk, you break the world. If you stay silent, the garden dies. If we fix the garden, we give Kalen his megaphone. It's a lose-lose-lose scenario. I looked at Lyral. She was standing in the center of the chamber, surrounded by the glowing, cancerous roots. She looked so fragile, yet she was the only thing standing between a civilization and its own self-destruction. Is this why you stopped talking? I asked. Because you heard the screaming? I was 5 years old, she said, her voice small and hollow. I touched the great pillar. I heard the voices of the stars. They were so loud, Case, so full of hurt. I knew that if I spoke, I would let that hurt into my home. So I closed the door. I locked it and threw away the key. I felt a surge of respect for her that I couldn't put into words. This kid had spent 12 years in a self-imposed prison, enduring the needles and the healers and the disappointment of her parents, all to protect them from a truth they weren't ready to hear. That wasn't a medical condition. That was the bravest thing I'd ever heard of. You're a hell of a soldier, Lyral, I said. She looked at me confused. I am not a soldier. I am a princess. In my book, a soldier is anyone who stands their ground when everyone else is running, I said, and you've been standing your ground for a long time. I walked over to the central processor. It was a monolith of black obsidian and pulsing violet light. It was the brain of the operation, the thing that was managing the data flow between the roots and the palace. I can't shut it down, I said, examining the interface, but I can redirect the flow. If I can bypass the transmission array, I can send the data back into the soil. We use the garden as a filter instead of a hard drive. The plants will still have to process the noise, but they won't be choked by it. It'll be like a forest floor composting old leaves. It'll take time, maybe years, but the garden will survive. And Kalen? Kalen will lose his megaphone, I said with a grin. He'll still have his siren leaf trees, but they'll be singing about the weather instead of military secrets. He's going to be one unhappy harmonizer. I pulled out my multi-tool and started popping the panels off the processor. I need you to help me, Lyral. I can do the wiring, but I need you to tell the roots what's happening. You need to sing to them. Not a command, not a trigger, just a lullaby. Tell them it's okay to let go. She looked at the obsidian tower, then at me. I am afraid, Case. If I open the door, even a little, the darkness might get out. I stopped what I was doing and looked her in the eyes. I'm not going to let that happen. I'll be right here. If the darkness starts coming, you just grab my hand and we'll close the door together. You're not doing this alone. Not this time. She took a long, shaky breath. She stepped toward the processor and placed both her hands on the cold stone. She looked at me, and I gave her a sharp nod. Whenever you're ready, kid, let's clean the slate. Lyral closed her eyes. She began to hum. It was the same song from before, but this time it was deeper, more resonant. It felt like the ground beneath us was turning into water, rippling with the sound of her voice. I dove into the guts of the machine. I was ripping out fiber optic cables, rerouting energy conduits, and bypassing security overrides with the speed of a man who knew he was running out of time. My hands were covered in blue cooling fluid, my fingers were cramping, but I didn't stop. The processor began to scream, a high-pitched digital shriek that made my teeth ache. The violet light turned a blinding white, and the sub-level started to shake. "Keep going," I yelled over the noise. "Don't stop!" Lyral's voice rose, becoming a clear, soaring melody that cut through the mechanical screaming. She wasn't just humming anymore. She was singing. It wasn't in any language I knew, but I understood the meaning. It was about rain on a dry field. It was about the sun breaking through the clouds. It was about forgiveness. The black growths on the roots began to dissolve. They turned into a shimmering silver dust that was absorbed back into the blue fluid. The tubes began to clear, the roots turning from a sickly gray to a vibrant, healthy white. Suddenly, the processor let out one final, explosive puff of ozone and went dark. The silence that followed was absolute. I fell back against the wall, gasping for air. My chest felt like it had been hit by a freight train. I looked at the machine. It was dead. The transmission array was fried. The databank was empty. I looked at Lyral. She was still standing with her hands on the stone. Her head was bowed, her white hair obscuring her face. "Kid?" I asked, pushing myself up. "You okay?" She slowly turned around. She looked exhausted, her crystalline skin pale and translucent. But her eyes were clear. The violet was bright and steady, with no trace of the storm that had been there before. She walked over to me and held out her hand. "It is gone, Case. The screaming has stopped." I took her hand and pulled myself up. "Yeah, it's gone. You did it." "We did it," she corrected. We climbed back out of the sub-level and into the indigo light of the arboretum. The air felt different. It was lighter, fresher. The siren leaf trees were swaying gently in the breeze, and their song was soft and peaceful, like the rustling of silk. We stood there for a moment, just breathing in the new world we'd created. But the peace didn't last long. From the balcony above, the sound of clapping echoed through the dome. "Bravo, human," a voice said. I looked up. Kalen was standing there, but he wasn't alone. He had 20 soldiers with him, and this time, they weren't carrying pulse rifles. They were carrying heavy industrial-grade containment units. "I must admit, I didn't think you had it in you," Kalen said, his voice dripping with venom. "You've destroyed 12 years of data collection. You've blinded our intelligence network. You've essentially disarmed a sovereign nation." "I saved your garden, you hack," I shouted, "and I saved your princess." "You've ruined everything," Kalen said, his eyes turning a dark, dangerous purple. "But you've also proven something very important. Lyral doesn't need the resonance to control the Arboretum. She just needs the right motivation," he signaled to the soldiers. "Take them both, the human to the detention block, the princess to the high sanctum. We're going to find out exactly how much more she can sing when she's watching her friend be spaced." The soldiers moved in, their boots clanking on the metal tiers. I grabbed my wrench and pulled Lyral behind me, but I knew the odds. 20-1 in a closed dome. "Case," Lyral whispered, grabbing my sleeve. "I know, kid," I said, my eyes scanning the room for an exit. "Stay close. This is where it gets messy." As the soldiers descended, I realized that my grandfather was right about one thing. A garden is a place where things grow, but sometimes you have to burn the field before you can plant the next crop, and I was feeling very, very much like starting a fire. "Eyes up, Lyral," I muttered, my voice turning into that cold, hard steel of a man with nothing left to lose. "It's time to show them what happens when you push a gardener too far." The detention block in the high sanctum didn't have iron bars or laser grids. Instead, it was a room made of pure, translucent amber that vibrated at a frequency designed to turn your brain into mush. They called it a harmonic dampening cell. To me, it just felt like being trapped inside a giant, humming headache. I sat on the cold floor, leaning my back against the vibrating wall, and tried to ignore the way my vision was starting to blur. My wrench had been confiscated, along with my kit bag and my pride. Now I was just a mud-stained human in a glass box, waiting for the high and mighty to decide when I was no longer useful. "You really stepped in at this time, Case," I muttered to myself. My voice sounded flat and tinny, the amber walls soaking up the sound before it could even echo. I checked my internal clock. I'd been in this box for approximately 6 hours and 20 minutes. Every few minutes, a guard would shimmer past the door, his crystalline skin glowing with a smug, violet light. They didn't even look at me. To them, I was just a glitch in the system that was about to be deleted. But they made one big mistake. They thought that because I was a human, I couldn't understand the architecture of their world. They thought I was just a scavenger who got lucky with a trowel. They forgot that before the war, before the discharge, I was a bio-combat engineer. I didn't just grow flowers. I built fortifications out of living tissue. I understood how roots held up a mountain and how sap moved through a trunk like oil through an engine. And this prison? It wasn't built. It was grown. I leaned forward and pressed my palm against the floor. I closed my eyes, trying to filter out the high-pitched hum of the dampening field. I went back to the lessons Lyral had taught me in the garden. I didn't listen for a voice. I listened for the pulse. There, deep beneath the amber, about 2 meters down, I felt the rhythmic thrum of the spire's primary nutrient line. It was a massive capillary, thicker than a man's waist, carrying the bioliquid that kept the high sanctum alive. And it was struggling. Since the purging of the Arboretum, the entire building was in a state of low-level shock. The pulse was erratic, skipping beats, like a heart that had just survived a massive trauma. "Okay, big guy," I whispered, my fingers digging into a microscopic fissure in the floor. "Let's see if you're still in the mood for a chat." I didn't have my tools, but I had my hands. I'd spent years working on the mud-hollow planets where you had to graft vines using nothing but your teeth and your own spit. I found a tiny hair-like root that had managed to pierce the amber seal near the corner. It was dry and brittle, almost dead. I pricked my thumb on a sharp edge of the amber wall until a single drop of blood welled up. I pressed it against the dying root. Humans and Etherians are different in almost every way, but on a molecular level, life is life. My blood was rich with iron and salt, the very things this crystalline building was starving for. I felt the root shiver. It drank the moisture, its fibers turning from gray to a faint pulsing red. "That's it," I breathed, my heart racing. "Now, tell your big brothers downstairs that the gardener is still on the clock." I closed my eyes and pushed a mental image through the connection. I didn't use words. Words were for people who didn't understand the soil. I sent the feeling of the Lumina Rose. I sent the memory of the rain on earth. I sent the vibration of Lorel's song. The floor beneath me groaned. It wasn't a loud sound, but I felt it in my marrow. The amber began to ripple, the frequency shifting from a hostile hum to a low, mournful moan. Outside the cell, the violet light of the hallway flickered and died. "Hey, what's the holdup?" a guard shouted, his voice echoing down the corridor. "Why is the dampening field clipping?" I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. "Maybe the building is tired of your mouth, pal," I yelled back. I felt the amber wall behind me soften. It didn't break. It yielded. The living material was responding to the surge I'd triggered in the nutrient line. I leaned my weight against the surface, and it felt like leaning into thick, warm wax. Slowly, agonizingly, I started to sink through. I popped out on the other side into a service conduit, gasping for air that didn't smell like bleach. The conduit was a dark, narrow tunnel filled with hissing pipes and pulsing veins. I was covered in amber residue, and my head felt like it had been put through a blender, but I was out. "Snafu," I whispered, wiping the gunk from my face. "Everything is definitely snafu." I started crawling toward the upper levels. I knew where they would take her. The high sanctum had a specialized chamber at the very peak, the resonance pulse. It was the broadcast station where the Etherians used to communicate with their colonies across the sector. Now it was Kalen's favorite torture chamber. As I climbed, I passed through various sectors of the spire. The higher I went, the more the architecture changed. The beauty of the lower levels was gone, replaced by jagged, utilitarian structures of black glass and silver wire. This was the military heart of Aethelgard. I saw dozens of soldiers rushing toward the arboretum, their armor clanking and their voices filled with panic. "The human has escaped," one of them yelled. "Seal the tears. Do not let him reach the princess." "Fat chance, you crystal-headed grunts," I muttered, sliding behind a massive ventilation fan. I reached the level of the resonance pulse after 40 minutes of climbing. The air here was vibrating so hard it made my teeth rattle. I could hear a sound coming from the chamber ahead, a high, piercing melody that was being forced through an amplifier. It wasn't a song. It was a scream that had been polished until it looked like music. I reached a set of heavy, silver doors. 2 guards stood in front of them, their rifles leveled at the hallway. They were on high alert, their eyes scanning every shadow. I didn't have time for a stealthy approach. My back was against the wall, and I was running on fumes and anger. I looked at a heavy coolant pipe running along the ceiling. It was marked with a warning symbol in bright yellow. High-pressure biofluid. "Check 6, boys," I whispered. I grabbed a discarded piece of metal from the floor and threw it with everything I had at the pipe's pressure valve. The metal struck home with a satisfying clang. The valve sheared off, and a jet of freezing blue liquid sprayed across the hallway. The guards shouted in surprise, their vision obscured by the thick, icy mist. I didn't wait. I charged through the fog, my shoulder hitting the first guard like a battering ram. He went down hard, his rifle skittering across the floor. The second guard tried to swing his weapon, but I was already inside his guard. I grabbed his arm and twisted, feeling the crystalline structure of his wrist give way with a sickening crunch. "Sorry, pal," I said, kicking his legs out from under him. "Gardener's rules. No pests allowed." I grabbed one of their pulse rifles. I hated the things, but I needed the punch, and kicked the silver doors open. The chamber was a nightmare of light. In the center, suspended in a harness of glowing silver wires, was Lyril. Her eyes were wide, her mouth open in a silent cry. Cables were attached to her temples, her throat, and her wrists, all of them leading to a massive, rotating lens that was pointed toward the star outside the dome. Kalen stood at the control console, his hands buried in a sea of holographic light. He looked like a madman, his face illuminated by the flickering data streams. "Stop it!" I yelled, firing a warning shot into the ceiling. The pulse bolt left a blackened scorch mark on the silver tiles. "Shut it down, Kalen! Now!" Kalen turned, a cold, triumphant smile spreading across his face. "Ah, the human. You're just in time for the finale. The Arboretum is purging the corruption, just as you intended. But all that energy has to go somewhere. I'm simply giving it a direction." "You're killing her," I shouted, moving closer. Loral's skin was glowing so bright it was hard to look at her. She looked like she was being eaten by her own light. "She is being perfected," Kalen countered, his voice rising above the roar of the machines. "She is becoming the voice of 1,000 worlds. Through her, Aethelgard will speak, and the galaxy will listen. The threat of the Void Walkers will be ended forever by the weight of our collective truth." "That's not truth, you scrap heap." I stepped into the light, the heat from the lens singing my eyebrows. "That's just noise. You're turning her into a bomb. Look at her." Loral looked at me then. Through the pain and the blinding light, she found my eyes. She didn't speak, but I felt the vibration in the room shift. It wasn't a command. It was a plea. "Help me." I looked at the harness. It wasn't just holding her. It was feeding on her. The wires were digging into her skin, drinking the resonance she was producing. I knew that if I tried to cut the wires with the rifle, I'd probably kill her. I needed to break the connection at the source. I looked at the floor beneath Kalen's feet. The entire platform was a massive biocapacitor, pulsing with the stolen energy of the garden. "Hey, Kalen!" I shouted, dropping the rifle. He sneered at me. "Giving up, gardener? Sensible. A primitive like you has no place in a symphony like this." "I'm not giving up," I said, kneeling down and pressing my hands to the floor. "I'm just changing the frequency." I didn't send a memory this time. I didn't send a feeling of peace. I sent the roar of the war. I sent the sound of the colony ships breaking apart in the atmosphere. I sent the sheer, ugly, messy chaos of 1,000 years of human history. I sent the grit and the grease and the blood. The building screamed. The biocapacitor beneath Kalen's feet turned a violent, angry red. The smooth, elegant lines of the Etherean tech began to warp and twist. The silver wires holding Lyrol started to spark and fray. "What are you doing?" Kalen screamed. His holographic display shattered into a million pieces of digital glass. "You're contaminating the signal. You're destroying the purity." "Purity is for people who don't live in the real world," I yelled back, my teeth aching from the feedback. "Life is messy, Kalen. It's dirty, and it doesn't fit into your little boxes." The lens above Lyrol cracked with a sound like a thunderclap. The silver harness snapped and Lyrol fell, her body hitting the platform with a dull thud. The light in the room vanished, replaced by the dim, flickering red of the emergency systems. I scrambled across the platform and gathered her into my arms. She was cold, so cold it felt like holding a block of ice. Her eyes were closed, and her breathing was so shallow I almost couldn't feel it. "Lyrol? Kid? Come on, talk to me." She didn't move. Her skin was dull, the violet veins barely visible. Kalen was lying on the floor a few meters away, his robes scorched and his eyes unfocused. He let out a weak, rattling laugh. You've flatlined the system. You've killed the resonance. You've killed us all." "I've saved her," I said, pulling her closer. "The rest of you can find your own way home." I looked toward the door. I could hear the sounds of 100 soldiers approaching. We were trapped in the highest point of the spire, with no weapons, no allies, and a girl who was fading faster than a sunset. This was the moment, the turning point. I could try to fight my way out, but I knew I wouldn't make it 10 meters. I had to trust the one thing I'd been trying to avoid since I got here. I had to trust the people I'd been judging as nothing but crystalline machines. I picked up Lyrol and stood up. I didn't hide. I walked right out of the chamber and into the hallway, facing the wall of soldiers that was waiting for us. "Stop!" I yelled, my voice echoing through the spire. The soldiers raised their rifles, the violet lights of their sights centering on my chest. I didn't flinch. I looked at the man in the front, the captain of the guard, a tall Etherean named Valen, who had been watching me in the garden for days. "Look at her!" I shouted, holding Lyrol out so they could see her pale, lifeless form. "This is your princess. This is the girl you've been protecting for 12 years. Kalen did this. He turned her into a circuit board, and then he tried to burn her out." Valen lowered his rifle, his eyes wide with horror. The other soldiers hesitated, their weapons wavering. "He says I'm the threat," I continued, my voice shaking with rage. "I'm just a guy who wanted to grow some roses. He's the one who turned your home into a weapon. He's the one who was willing to space his own people to satisfy his ego. Look at her and tell me who the real primitive is." Valen looked at Lyrol, then at the smoking wreckage of the resonance pulse behind me. He looked back at his men. The silence in the hallway was heavy, the tension so thick it felt like it might snap the spire in two. "He is right," a voice said from the back of the crowd. The soldiers parted, and Matriarch Valeria stepped forward. She looked older than she had 2 days ago. Her crown was tilted, and her eyes were red with tears. She walked toward me, her silk robes rustling on the silver floor. She reached out and touched Lyrol's cheek. "My daughter," she whispered. "She needs the garden," I said, my voice softening. "She doesn't need doctors or priests. She needs the soil. She needs to hear the trees again, not the screaming ones, the real ones." The matriarch looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see a queen or a crystalline being. I saw a mother who had realized her mistakes. "Take her," she said to Valen, "and take the human. If he says the garden will save her, then the garden is where she stays. And someone find Kalen. I want him brought to me in chains." Valen nodded, his face grim. "Copy that, Your Majesty." As the soldiers surged past me to arrest Kalen, I felt the strength leave my legs. I sank to my knees, still holding Lyrol. I looked at the matriarch and saw the cost of 12 years of silence written in the lines of her face. We had reached the peak, but the fall was going to be a long one. The journey back down to the Arboretum was a blur of silver corridors and whispered prayers. We were moving fast, a small unit of elite guards clearing the way for me as I carried Lyrol. The spire was in total chaos. Alarms were blaring on every tier, and the light grids were flickering in and out as the building's biological systems struggled to recalibrate. "Status on the atmosphere?" Valen barked into his comm unit. "Falling in the lower sectors, Captain," a voice crackled back. "The Arboretum is flatlining. The oxygen scrubbers are down to 20%. "We're running out of time," I said, my breath coming in ragged gas. Lyral felt heavier with every step, her body like a cold weight against my chest. "If we don't get her to the core, the whole dome is going to go dark." We reached the entrance to the Arboretum just as the main seals were beginning to close. Valen shoved his rifle into the track, the metal groaning as the heavy amber doors tried to crush it. "Get in there," he yelled. "We'll hold the doors." I scrambled through the gap, my boots hitting the gray dust of the garden tiers. The air here was thin and cold, and the smell of ozone was so strong it made my eyes water. The trees were silent, no humming, no singing, just the eerie, dead stillness of a forest before a storm. I ran toward the center of the dome, toward the great pillar that housed the Arboretum's core. I could see the light from the core fading, the violet glow turning to a dull, sickly brown. I reached the base of the pillar and laid Lyral down on the mossy ground. I didn't know if this would work. I didn't have a plan, and I didn't have any tech. All I had was the memory of a girl who liked the smell of mud and a garden that was starving for something real. "Come on, kid," I whispered, kneeling beside her. "Don't quit on me now. We've still got 2 light years of weeds to pull." I looked at the great pillar. It was a massive structure of translucent crystal, its surface covered in a web of silver wires and data ports. This was where Kalen had been tuning the garden. I saw a heavy interface cable lying on the ground, its tip sparking with blue energy. It was meant to be plugged into Lyral's neck. I picked up the cable and looked at it. The tech was elegant, precise, and completely heartless. It was designed to bypass the heart and go straight for the brain. "No," I said, throwing the cable into the shadows. "Not that way." I looked at Lyral's hand. It was lying limp on the gray soil. I took my knife and made a small, shallow cut on my own palm. Then I reached down and did the same to hers. I pressed our palms together, skin to skin, blood to blood. "I'm not a king, and I'm not a priest," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm just a guy who knows how to plant the seed. And I'm telling you, this garden needs you. It doesn't want the signal. It wants the song." I closed my eyes and reached out to the garden. I didn't go for the wires or the ports. I went for the roots. I pushed everything I had left into the connection, the exhaustion, the fear, the anger, but mostly the hope. I thought about the yellow roses my sister loved. I thought about the way the sun felt on a warm afternoon in Jakarta. I thought about the first time Lyral had smiled at the dirt. The ground beneath us shivered. It wasn't the violent, mechanical shaking of the spire. It was a soft, rhythmic vibration, like a massive cat purring in the dark. I felt a surge of warmth pass from my palm into Lyral's. "Radiant," I whispered. The word felt like it was being pulled from my lungs. I wasn't just saying it, I was feeling it. Lyral's hand twitched. Her fingers curled around mine, her grip tightening until it hurt. Her skin began to glow, not with the blinding artificial white of the high sanctum, but with a soft, warm violet light that looked like the sky just before dawn. The light spread from her hand into the soil, moving like a wave of liquid fire through the tears. I watched as the gray moss turned green in an instant. The siren leaf trees began to shiver, their leaves rustling as if a wind had just swept through the dome. And then the singing started. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a broadcast. It was a chorus of 1,000 different voices, each one unique, each one beautiful. The trees were talking to each other. The vines were whispering to the flowers. The entire arboretum was waking up, but this time it was waking up for itself. The great pillar began to pulse with a deep, steady light. The brown faded away, replaced by a vibrant indigo that lit up the entire dome. I felt the air grow thicker and sweeter as the oxygen scrubbers roared back to life. Lyral opened her eyes. They weren't glowing stars anymore. They were just eyes, soft, purple, and filled with tears. "Case," she whispered. It was the first time she had said my name. Her voice was clear and steady, with no trace of the cracked, rusty sound from the day before. "I'm here, kid," I said, leaning my forehead against hers. "I'm right here." The screaming, she said, looking around the dome. It's, it's different now. It's not a scream. It's a conversation. Yeah, I said, wiping a tear from my cheek. That's what it was always supposed to be. They were just trying to turn the volume up too high. We sat there for a long time, just listening to the garden breathe. The chaos outside seemed like it was a million light years away. For a few minutes, we were the only two people in the universe who understood that the greatest power wasn't in the guns or the cannons. It was in the quiet space between the notes. But the peace didn't last. The amber doors at the entrance finally gave way, and a squad of soldiers burst into the dome. They weren't Valen's men. They were wearing the black armor of the High Sanctum's internal security, Kalen's personal guard. There they are, the leader shouted, pointing his rifle at us. Take the human. Secure the princess. I stood up, pulling Lyral behind me. I didn't have a weapon, and I was too tired to fight, but I wasn't going to let them touch her. Step back, I yelled. The matriarch ordered us here. Kalen is under arrest. Kalen has been liberated, the soldier said, his voice cold and mechanical, and the matriarch is being protected for her own safety. The council has declared a state of emergency. Aethelgard is at war, and we need our weapon. He stepped forward, the violet light of his sight centering on my forehead. Step away from the princess, human, or we will be forced to use lethal measures. I looked at Lyral. She wasn't afraid. She stood up beside me, her hand still holding mine. She looked at the soldiers, and then she looked at the trees. No, she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made the soldiers pause. It wasn't the radiant command of a weapon. It was the simple, absolute authority of a person who knew who she was. You will not use this place for your war, she said, stepping forward. The Arboretum is not a shield. It is a home, and if you try to take it, it will defend itself. You're a child, the leader sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger. You don't know the first thing about defense. Now move. He fired. The pulse bolt was a streak of violet light, moving faster than the eye could follow. I tried to throw myself in front of her, but I was too slow. The bolt never hit us. 10 meters away, a cortex vine snapped out of the shadows like a whip. It caught the pulse bolt in midair, absorbing the energy in a shower of blue sparks. Before the soldiers could react, the ground beneath them exploded with activity. Massive roots burst through the silver tiles, wrapping around the soldiers' legs and pulling them to the floor. The siren leaf trees began to hum a discordant, jarring note that made the men drop their weapons and claw at their ears. What is this? The leader screamed, struggling against the vines that were pinning him to the ground. What have you done to it? I didn't do anything, I said, watching the garden defend its queen. I told you Kalen was trying to control it. Lyral just gave it permission to be itself. Within 2 minutes, the entire squad was neutralized. They weren't dead. The garden didn't seem interested in killing, but they were stuck, wrapped in layers of thick, pulsing vegetation that didn't care about their armor or their rank. Lyral walked toward the leader. She knelt down, her silver dress rustling in the wind. Tell Kalen, she said softly. The door's closed, and I have the only key. She touched a leaf near the soldier's face, and he slumped into a deep, dreamless sleep. I walked over to her, my heart still pounding in my throat. Well, I guess we don't have to worry about the security detail anymore. Case, she said, turning to look at me. Her expression was grave. This is only the beginning. Kalen will not stop. He will bring the council. He will bring the fleet. He will burn the spire to the ground to get what he wants. Then we'd better start planning the defense, I said, looking around the vibrant singing dome. But first, we need to find the matriarch. If we're going to save this place, we need a queen who's willing to get her hands dirty. I offered her my hand. You ready for round 3, princess? She took my hand, a small, determined smile on her face. I am ready, Case, but no more silence. From now on, we speak. We walked toward the exit, the garden parting for us like a sea of green. I looked back one last time at the great pillar, and for a second I thought I saw a flicker of white light in the core. A single, perfect lumina rose, blooming in the center of the machine. Maybe Kalen was right about one thing. Aethelgard was about to change, but it wasn't going to be a symphony of war. It was going to be a song of the soil, and I was going to make sure every soul on this orbital shell heard every single note. As we stepped through the doors, I checked my internal clock one more time. It had been exactly 12 hours since I arrived at the Arboretum. In 12 hours, I'd been a prisoner, a bioengineer, a gardener, and a revolutionary. 50 credits, I muttered to myself. I'm definitely asking for a raise after this. Lyra laughed, a real, genuine sound that echoed through the silver hallway. I think you have earned it, Case. Perhaps even 60 credits. Don't get greedy, kid, I said, grinning. Let's go save a kingdom. We disappeared into the chaos of the spire. Two outsiders in a world of crystal, ready to show the galaxy that sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that has been waiting in the quiet for 12 years. The battle for Aethelgard had begun, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly which side of the line I was standing on. I was on the side of the plants, and they were feeling very, very hungry. The air in the maintenance tunnels of Aethelgard tasted like copper and desperation. I was hunched over, moving through a space designed for service drones, carrying 40 kilograms of biological improvised explosives, and a girl who had just found her voice but was still finding her feet. My knees felt like they were filled with crushed glass, and my internal clock was screaming that it had been over 30 hours since I'd had anything resembling a meal. We were deep in the guts of the spire, 3 levels below the high sanctum, navigating a labyrinth of pulsing pipes and data veins. Check 6, Lyral, I whispered, the word coming out as a dry rasp. They're using the heat scanners now. If you feel the temperature in the walls spike, we move. Fast. She nodded, her hand tight on my sleeve. She wasn't glowing anymore, but she had a look in her eyes that was far more dangerous than any bioluminescent display. It was a cold, hard focus. 12 years of being a spectator in her own life had turned her into a master observer. She saw the flickers in the light grids before I did. She felt the vibrations of the soldiers' boots 5 floors up. They are moving toward the ventilation hub, she said, her voice a steady melodic anchor in the dark. Captain Valen is being held in the lower barracks. He is shouting. I can hear the resonance of his anger in the steel. Good, if he's shouting, he's alive, I muttered. We need his grunts if we're going to pull this off. Kalen has the High Council in his pocket, but the rank and file don't like seeing their princess used as a battery. We reached a junction where the pipes merged into a massive cooling reservoir. I stopped and set my kit bag down, my hands shaking as I pulled out a handful of the siren leaf seeds I'd salvaged from the Arboretum. To anyone else, they were just husks. To a biocombat engineer, they were the most efficient saboteurs in the quadrant. Listen to me, Lyrel, I said, kneeling so I was eye level with her. Kalen thinks he's won because he has the keys to the palace, but he forgot who builds the palace. He forgot that every pillar in this spire is a living thing. We're not going to fight them with rifles. We're going to fight them with the roots. I am afraid of what I will hear, she admitted, her fingers brushing against a pulsating vein in the wall. The last time I talked to the spire, it was screaming. That's because it was being tortured, I said, my voice softening. But you're not a torturer. You're the gardener. You don't tell them what to do. You ask them for help. There's a difference. That's the lesson my grandmother taught Lily. You don't fix the silence. You just make it safe enough for the music to come back. She looked at the seeds in my palm, then at the black glass walls surrounding us. She took a long, shaky breath and reached out, touching the seeds. The violet glow returned to her fingertips, soft and nurturing. I will try, Case. She closed her eyes and began to hum. It wasn't the high-pitched shriek of the resonance weapon. It was a low, earthy vibration that seemed to sink into the floor. I watched, fascinated, as the seeds in my hand began to sprout, their roots growing at an impossible speed, weaving themselves into the gaps of the maintenance tunnel. Copy that, I whispered, a grim smile tugging at my lips. Now let's go see the Queen. We bypassed 2 more security checkpoints by having Lyrel whisper to the doors, convincing the ancient biological locks that we were part of the spire's own immune system. It was the ultimate inside man job. By the time we reached the matriarch's private chambers, the building itself was actively hiding our presence, damping the sound of my boots and masking our heat signatures with diverted cooling fluid. The matriarch's room was a cage of shimmering gold, guarded by 4 soldiers in black armor. They were standing perfectly still, their pulse rifles held at the ready. Wait, I whispered, pulling Lyrel back. We can't just barge in. Those guys are the heavy hitters. They won't hesitate to burn us down. They will not see me, Laryl said. She stepped out into the hallway, her silver dress catching the dim light. Before I could grab her, she raised her hand and spoke a single, rhythmic phrase in Aetherian. The air around the guards began to ripple. The aura ferns that decorated the hallway suddenly grew 3 meters in seconds, their thick, velvet leaves wrapping around the soldiers like a soft blanket. The guards didn't even struggle. They simply slumped against the walls, lulled into a deep, chemical-induced sleep by the plant's spores. Slick, I muttered, stepping over a snoring soldier. Remind me never to get on your bad side, kid. We pushed open the doors. Matriarch Valerius was standing by the window, looking out over the flickering lights of the Dyson Shell. She looked smaller than I remembered, her crystalline skin translucent with grief. When she turned and saw Lyrol, she didn't cry out. She simply fell to her knees, her hands reaching for her daughter. You came back, the matriarch whispered. I am not the girl who left, Mother, Lyrol said, helping her stand. The human has taught me that silence is a choice, but so is standing up. Kyrr. Kalen has declared me incompetent, the matriarch said, her voice shaking. He has the fleet in orbit. He says that if the radiant weapon is not activated within 6 hours, the Void Walkers will detect our weakness and descend. He is using fear to turn our people into a hive mind. Fear is a hell of a drug, I said, leaning against the doorframe. But it doesn't stand up well to the truth. Your Majesty, we don't have much time. Kalen is going to try to force the transmission again. He's going to use the Arboretum's core to broadcast a message of war across the sector. If he does that, he'll burn out the garden for good, and Aethelgard will go dark. What do you need from me? Valerius asked, her eyes finding mine. I need you to be the queen again, I said. I need you to authorize a biological purge. If you give the order, the Spire systems will prioritize the princess's commands over Kalen's overrides. We can scuttle his control from the inside out. It will be dangerous, the matriarch warned. The council will see it as an act of treason. It's only treason if we lose, I said. Right now it's just gardening on a grand scale. The matriarch nodded, her expression hardening into the steel I'd seen during my first day in the throne room. She walked to her desk and touched a hidden seal, pulling up a holographic command interface that was far more complex than anything Kalen had been using. I, Matriarch Valerius of Aethelgard, authorize the transfer of primary resonance to the heir apparent, Lyrol, she said, her voice echoing through the chamber. Biological purge initiated. May the roots remember our name. The spire groaned. It was a sound that shook the very foundations of the orbital shell. Every light in the palace turned a deep, vibrant green. The data veins in the walls began to pulse with a new energy, a rhythm that was steady and calm. He will know, Lyrol said, looking toward the high sanctum. Let him know, I said, checking the power cell on my pulse rifle. It's time we showed him that you can't control the music if you don't love the song. We're moving to the central hub. We need to wake up the rest of the garden before Kalen's grunts realize the house is talking back. We left the matriarch to coordinate the political resistance and headed back into the tunnels. But this time, we weren't alone. As we moved, I saw movement in the shadows. It wasn't soldiers. It was the Aetherian commoners, the servants, the technicians, the people who actually kept this place running. They were standing by the walls, their hands pressed against the green glowing vines. They feel her, I whispered. They are listening, Lyrol said. For 12 years, they heard only the noise of Kalen's machines. Now they are hearing the spire again. We reached the central hub, a massive chamber where the primary data veins of the entire Dyson Shell converged. It was guarded by 20 of Kalen's elite soldiers, and they weren't napping this time. They were positioned behind heavy barricades, their rifles trained on every entrance. This is it, kid, I said, crouching behind a massive pillar of bonewood. The big one. If we can take this hub, we can broadcast your voice to the entire shell. Every person, every plant, every machine will hear the truth. How will we get past them? She asked, looking at the barricades. I'm a bio-combat engineer, remember? I pulled out the last of my siren leaf explosives. We don't go around the wall. We grow through it. I looked at the soldiers. They were young, most of them no older than 25. They looked scared, their eyes darting around the darkening room. They weren't villains. They were just kids who had been told that the world was ending and that Kalen was the only one who could save them. Wait, I said, putting the explosives back in my bag. Case, if I blow that barricade, half of those kids aren't coming home, I said, my heart pounding in my chest. And that's exactly what Kalen wants. He wants us to be the monsters he's been warning them about. He wants a war. I looked at the humanistic theme I'd been trying to live by. Acceptance, patience, understanding. If I used violence now, I was just another soldier in a galaxy full of them. I was just another man trying to fix a problem with a hammer. L'Oreal, I said, taking her hand, can you talk to them? Not the spire, not the trees, the soldiers. They will not listen, she said, her eyes wide. Kalen has told them I am possessed. He has told them that my voice is a curse. Then show them it's a gift, I said. Show them what you showed me in the garden. Show them that you're not a weapon. You're just a girl who loves green roses. She looked at me for a long moment, the fear in her eyes battling with a new, burgeoning strength. Then she nodded. She stood up, walking out from behind the pillar into the center of the hub. Princess, get back, the soldier captain yelled, his rifle shaking. Don't move or we will fire. Lyral didn't stop. She walked right up to the barricade, her hands open at her sides. She wasn't glowing. She wasn't humming. She was just a girl in a silver dress. I am Lyral, she said, her voice clear and steady, and I have been quiet for 12 years, not because I was broken, but because I was waiting for someone to listen. The soldiers hesitated. The captain's finger was white on the trigger, but he didn't pull it. Kalen tells you that the galaxy is full of shadows, Lyral continued. He tells you that we must be a weapon to survive. But look at the walls. The spire is not a weapon. It is a home. It breathes with us. It grows with us. And it is tired of being afraid. She reached out and touched the barricade, a cold metallic structure of black glass. At her touch, a single tiny green shoot burst from the seam of the glass. It grew slowly, winding its way around the barrel of the captain's rifle. It didn't break the gun. It just held it. We do not need to fire the cannons to be strong, she said, looking the captain in the eyes. We just need to remember how to grow. The silence in the hub was absolute. For a heartbeat, the fate of Aethelgard hung on a single thread of green vine. Then slowly, the captain lowered his rifle. He looked at the green shoot, then at the princess, and then he stepped back from the barricade. Lower your weapons, he commanded, his voice thick with emotion. One by one, the soldiers dropped their rifles. They didn't surrender out of fear. They surrendered out of a sudden, overwhelming sense of relief. The pressure of 12 years of expectation, of fear, of being told they had to be warriors, it all vanished in the face of a single girl who told them it was okay to be quiet. I stepped out from the shadows, my hands raised. Nice work, kid, I whispered. We are not finished, Case, Lyral said, turning to the central interface. Kalen is at the high sanctum. He has the orbital override. If he can't have the spire, he will crash it into the gas giant. Then let's get to work, I said, cracking my knuckles. We've got a planet to save, and I'm pretty sure the plants are already halfway there. The final ascent to the high sanctum felt like climbing into the mouth of a hurricane. The spire was no longer a building. It was a battlefield of frequencies. Kalen had realized that he was losing his grip on the biological systems, so he had done the unthinkable. He had initiated a hard reboot of the Dyson Shell's central core. Imagine a tree being hit by 1,000,000 volts of electricity. That's what it felt like. The walls were screaming, a high-pitched digital shriek that made blood trickle from my ears. The green light of the biological purge was being overwritten by a violent, jagged red. He's killing it, Lyral cried out, her hands pressed to her temples. He's burning the roots to save the wires. We're almost there, I yelled over the roar of the atmospheric scrubbers. Just keep moving! We burst into the high sanctum. The air was thick with the smell of scorched ozone and melting crystal. Kalen was standing at the center of the resonance pulse, his hands buried deep in the control conduits. He wasn't even using the holograms anymore. He was manually rerouting the power, his skin blackened by the electrical feedback. Outside the massive observation windows, I could see the Etherian fleet. Hundreds of sleek, needle-shaped ships were closing in on the spire, their weapons charged with a terrifying violet energy. You're too late, Vane, Kalen screamed, his voice barely human. The sequence is locked. The resonance cannon is drawing power directly from the sun. If I can't lead a civilization of warriors, I will leave a galaxy of ash. You're insane, Kalen, I shouted, raising my rifle. You're going to kill everyone on this shell. A small price to pay for purity, he countered. The Void Walkers are coming. I can hear them in the static. Only the radiant voice can stop them. He turned his gaze toward Lyral. Speak, child. Speak the command. Save your people by destroying their enemies. It is what you were born for. Lyral stood at the edge of the platform, the wind from the cooling fans whipping her hair around her face. She looked at the fleet, then at the burning roots beneath her feet. She looked at me, and in that moment, I saw the choice she was making. It was the same choice I'd seen soldiers make on a dozen different worlds. The choice between what's easy and what's right. He's right, Case, she said, her voice sounding hauntingly calm amidst the chaos. I can hear the sun. I can feel the power. If I say the word, the fleet will be vaporized. The Void Walkers will never touch Aethelgard. We will be safe. At what cost, Lyral? I asked, lowering my rifle. My heart was breaking for her. If you use that voice to kill, you're just becoming the person he wanted you to be. You're becoming the weapon. You'll never be able to go back to the garden. But if I don't, we die, she whispered. Maybe, I said, stepping toward her, or maybe we find another way. A gardener doesn't kill the weeds by burning the whole field. He strengthens the soil until the weeds can't grow. We don't need a cannon, Lyral. We need a filter. I pointed to the central processor, the one we had redirected in the sublevel. If you can broadcast the song of the Arboretum instead of the command of the cannon, you won't kill the fleet. You'll just calm them. You'll remind them what it feels like to breathe. You'll wash away the fear Kalen has been feeding them. It will be too much, she said. The energy will... I don't think I can hold it all. I'll hold it with you, I said, reaching out my hand. Just like before. We'll be the ground for the lightning. Kalen let out a roar of rage and charged at us, a jagged blade of crystal appearing in his hand. I will not let a primitive destroy our destiny. I didn't even look at him. I just swung the butt of my rifle in a wide arc, catching him square in the jaw. He went down in a heap, his blade shattering against the floor. I didn't kill him. I didn't need to. He was already a ghost of a man, haunted by a future that didn't exist. I turned back to Lyral. Now, kid, while we still have a spire to stand on. She took my hand, her fingers interlocked with mine. She stepped toward the central lens, her eyes fixed on the star beyond the glass. She took a deep breath, and for the first time in her life, she let the music out without any barriers, without any fear, without any conditions. She didn't speak a word. She sang. It was a sound that defied description. It was the rustle of a billion leaves. It was the hum of 1,000 bees. It was the sound of a mother's heartbeat in the womb. It was the frequency of life itself. The resonance pulse caught the sound and magnified it, but instead of a beam of destruction, it sent out a ripple of pure emerald light. The wave washed over the spire, through the tiers, and out into the vacuum of space. It hit the fleet like a physical force, but instead of tearing the ships apart, it simply turned them off. The violet glow of their weapons faded. The engines went silent. I watched as the sleek ships drifted in the dark, their hulls suddenly glowing with the same soft green light as the Arboretum. Inside the spire, the red alarms died. The screaming of the walls was replaced by a low, contented purr. The scorched roots began to heal, new shoots of white and green appearing over the blackened scars. Lyral's body was arching, her skin glowing with such intensity that I could see the skeleton of the building through her form. I felt the energy surging through my own arms, a heat so fierce it felt like my blood was boiling. My vision went white, then black, then white again. "Hold on," I screamed, though I couldn't hear my own voice. "Just a little longer." Then with a final, blinding flash, the connection snapped. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. I was lying on the floor, my breath coming in short, painful gasps. My hands were scorched, and my hair smelled like burnt sugar. I rolled onto my side and saw Lyral lying a few meters away. She wasn't glowing anymore. She looked exhausted, her silver dress torn and dirty, but she was breathing. I crawled over to her and pulled her into my lap. "You did it, kid. You saved them all." She opened her eyes and looked up at the stars. The fleet was still there, but they weren't attacking. They were holding their positions, waiting for orders from a queen who was no longer afraid. I can hear them, Case," she whispered. "The Void Walkers?" I asked, my heart sinking. "No," she said, a small smile touching her lips. "The people. They're not shouting anymore. They're just talking about the garden, about the light, about what they're going to plant tomorrow." I looked out the window. The Dyson Shell was glowing, not with the artificial light of a machine, but with the soft, organic radiance of a billion living things working in harmony. Aethelgard had changed. It was no longer a fortress in the dark. It was a beacon. "Well," I said, leaning my head back against the cool glass, "I guess that's the end of the war." "It is the beginning of the growth," she corrected. We sat there for a long time, watching the ships begin to dock, watching the people of Aethelgard emerge from their homes to see the green world they had been promised. I looked at my scorched hands and realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the next fight. I was waiting for the spring. Kalen was led away by Valen's men a few minutes later. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the glowing garden with eyes that saw only ruin. He couldn't understand that to build something new, sometimes you have to let the old structures fall away. He couldn't understand that the greatest strength isn't in the things you can control, but in the things you can set free. The matriarch arrived soon after, her face wet with tears. She didn't speak to the council or the guards. She just walked to her daughter and held her, and for the first time in 12 years, the royal family of Aethelgard was complete. I stood up, my legs still shaky, and started to walk toward the exit. My work here was done. I'd fixed the garden, I'd saved the princess, and I'd probably earned enough credits to buy a small moon. "Case!" I turned around. Lyril was standing with her mother, her hand outstretched. "Where are you going?" she asked. "The siren leaf trees in Sector 3 still need pruning, and you promised to show me how to graft the red roses." I looked at the girl who had just silenced a fleet with a song. I looked at the garden that was finally learning how to breathe. And then I looked at my own hands, hands that were built for war, but were finally learning how to heal. "You're right, princess," I said, a slow grin spreading across my face. "I did promise, and a gardener always keeps his word." I walked back toward her, leaving the war and the weapons behind. We had a lot of work to do. 3,000 levels of weeds, a billion hearts to calm, and an entire galaxy to teach how to listen. But as I looked at Lyril, I knew we had all the time in the world. "Case?" she asked as we headed back toward the Arboretum. "Yeah, kid? What is the word for when the sun hits the dew on a leaf just right?" I thought about it for a second, the Jakarta sun warm in my memory. "In my language, we call it hope." She nodded, her eyes bright. "Hope, I like that. Let's go plant some more of that." And as the stars watched over the glowing shell of Aethelgard, 2 gardeners, 1 human, 1 Etherian, descended into the green, ready to show the universe that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is simply let things grow. The silence that followed the resonant storm was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my 29 years of breathing. It wasn't the hollow, suffocating silence of a vacuum, nor was it the guarded, fearful silence Lyril had carried for 12 years. It was a dense, heavy peace, the kind you feel in a forest after a massive snowfall, where every sound is swallowed by a soft, white blanket. I sat on the floor of the high sanctum, my back against a cooling vent that was now humming with a gentle, steady rhythm, and watched the violet sparks fade from the air. My hands were shaking, and the skin on my palms was raw, but I didn't care. Beside me, Lyril was leaned against my shoulder, her breathing rhythmic and deep. She had expended more energy in those 10 minutes than most Etherians did in a lifetime, yet she looked more awake than I had ever seen her. The sickly, crystalline pallor of her skin had been replaced by a soft, warm glow that seemed to come from within. She wasn't a battery anymore. She was the sun. "Sit rep, Captain," I said, my voice sounding like I'd been eating gravel. Captain Valen stepped over a pile of shattered black glass, his armor scorched but his eyes clear. He looked at the soldiers who had been pinned by the vines. They were still sleeping. their faces peaceful. Then he looked out the window at the drifting fleet. He didn't pick up his rifle. Instead, he reached out and touched a green sprout that was growing from the silver doorframe. "The fleet has initiated a full stand-down, Vane," Valen said, his voice hushed. "The Admiral reported a sudden loss of aggression. He said that for a moment, every person on every ship forgot why they were holding a weapon. They just wanted to go home." "It's the resonance," Liral whispered, her eyes still closed. "The garden told them that they are enough, that they don't need to fight to be worthy of the light." I looked at Kalen. He was being hauled up by two guards, his face a bruised mess of resentment and disbelief. He looked at the growing plants, the healing roots, and the peaceful soldiers with a disgust that went down to his marrow. He still didn't get it. He probably never would. To him, anything that couldn't be quantified, controlled, or weaponized was a failure. "You've scuttled 1,000 years of progress," Kalen spat, blood staining his crystalline teeth. "You've turned a pinnacle of engineering into a common park. The Voidwalkers will see this weakness, human. They will come for us, and we will have nothing but flowers to throw at them. If they come, they'll find a people who know what they're fighting for," I said, standing up on shaky legs. "Not a bunch of drones waiting for a command. You didn't give this kingdom strength, Kalen. You gave it a cage, and cages always rust." The matriarch approached us, her regal bearing restored, though she had abandoned her crown somewhere in the chaos. She didn't look at Kalen. She looked at Liral, then at me. There was a profound, quiet weight in her gaze, a realization that she had been an architect of her daughter's prison. "Is the damage permanent?" Valerius asked, gesturing to the resonance pulse. "The transmission array is fried," I said, wiping a smear of blue fluid from my forehead. "But the biointerface is healthier than it's been in a decade." "The garden is filtering the data now, Mother. It's taking the noise and turning it into nutrients. It'll take some time, maybe a few years, but the spire will eventually become a self-sustaining ecosystem again. No more cannons, just a home." The matriarch nodded slowly. She reached out and took Liral's hand, holding it with a gentleness I hadn't seen before. "We have lived in fear for so long that we forgot how to listen to anything else. We thought your silence was a defect, Liral, a problem to be solved with logic and force. We never stopped to consider that you were the only one among us who was truly sane." "I wasn't sane, Mother," Liral said, looking her in the eyes. "I was just tired. I was tired of being the only one who could hear the garden crying. Case was the only one who didn't try to make me talk. He just sat in the dirt with me." I felt a lump in my throat. I looked away, staring out at the Dyson Shell. Below us, the lights were returning to the sectors, but they weren't the harsh, blinking lights of a military station. They were a soft, pulsing emerald. Thousands of people were stepping out onto their balconies, looking up at the spire. They weren't waiting for a command. They were just watching the sunrise. Over the next few days, the immediate aftermath of the rebellion was a whirlwind of logistics and labor. The High Council was dissolved, its members either fleeing into the Outer Rim or surrendering to the matriarch's new provisional government. Kalen was placed in a high-security cell in the lower levels, not one made of amber and vibrations, but one made of simple stone and sunlight. The matriarch insisted he be allowed to see the garden every day, a punishment he seemed to find more agonizing than any physical torture. I spent most of my time in the Arboretum. There was a lot of work to do. The hard reboot had saved the system, but it had also left a lot of scarred tissue. I was back in my element, covered in mud and grease, pruning back the scorched vines and grafting new shoots onto the siren leaf trees. But I wasn't doing it alone anymore. Dozens of Etherians, commoners, technicians, even a few of Valen's former guards, had come down to the garden to help. They didn't know the first thing about soil or nutrients, but they were eager to learn. I found myself becoming a sort of unofficial professor of dirt, teaching people with translucent skin and violet eyes how to use a trowel and how to tell when a plant was thirsty. "You're doing it wrong, Valen," I grunted, looking over at the captain of the guard. He was trying to prune an aura fern with a vibroblade. "You're not trying to kill the branch, you're trying to give it a haircut. Use the shears. Gently." Valen sighed, looking at his large crystalline hands. "I am a soldier, Vane. My hands were made for the rifle. This feels inefficient. Life is inefficient, I said, kneeling beside a cluster of lumina roses. That's the beauty of it. You can't optimize a soul, Captain. You just have to give it enough space to grow at its own pace. Look at this rose. It was almost gray 3 days ago. Now look at it. The rose was pulsing with a soft, steady white light. It wasn't the brightest flower in the garden, but it was healthy. It was enough. Valen looked at the flower for a long time. Then he put away the vibroblade and picked up the manual shears. He made a careful, deliberate cut, his movements slow and focused. I think I understand. For 12 years, we tried to force the princess to be our voice. We thought she was the missing piece of our machine, but she was never a piece of a machine. She was just Lyral. Exactly, I said. And the moment we stopped trying to fix her, she found the strength to save us. Funny how that works, isn't it? As the sun of Aethelgard set on the 5th day after the storm, I sat on the edge of the central tier, watching the blue mists swirl below. I felt a profound sense of change settling over me. For years, I had carried the guilt of Lily's silence like a backpack full of lead. I had convinced myself that I was a failure because I couldn't save her, because I couldn't make her talk again. But watching Lyral and watching these proud, crystalline people learn to love the messiness of the soil, I realized I had been wrong. Lily didn't need me to be her hero. She just needed me to be her brother. She didn't need to be fixed. She just needed to be seen. I pulled out my old battered comm unit and looked at the last photo I had of my sister. She was sitting in a garden of yellow roses, her eyes bright and focused on a butterfly. She wasn't talking. She wasn't smiling for the camera. She was just being. And for the first time in 10 years, I looked at that photo and didn't feel the urge to cry. I just felt a quiet, steady peace. I had come to Aethelgard looking for a paycheck and a place to hide. I had found a revolution and a reason to stay. I wasn't just a bio-combat engineer anymore. I wasn't just a soldier who had lost his way. I was a gardener. And in a universe that was so obsessed with building walls and weapons, maybe being a gardener was the most rebellious thing a human could be. 2 months had passed since the day the silence broke. Aethelgard was a different world now. The Dyson Shell was no longer a military fortress. It had become a sanctuary. The fleet had been repurposed for trade and exploration. Their weapons removed to make room for seed vaults and atmospheric stabilizers. The symphony of truth that Kalen had dreamed of had been replaced by a quiet, rhythmic hum, the collective heartbeat of a civilization that was finally learning how to breathe. I stood in the center of the song roots, the new name we had given to the Resonance Arboretum. It was a lush, vibrant jungle of green and violet, the air thick with the scent of blooming flowers and wet earth. The trees were no longer silent. They sang a low, melodic song that resonated with the pulses of everyone who walked among them. It wasn't a broadcast. It was a conversation. Lyral was kneeling near the great pillar, her silver dress stained with dark jacquard loam. She was working with a group of children, showing them how to graft whisper reeds onto the central roots. She was talking, not constantly, but when she had something to say. Sometimes she would go for hours without a word, and nobody pressured her. Nobody looked at her with expectation or pity. They just accepted her silence as part of the music. "Is the nutrient mix ready, Case?" she asked, looking up at me with a smile. "Almost," I said, hauling a 50-kilogram bag of organic compost onto the tier. "I've got the nitrogen levels exactly where they need to be. Another 2 weeks and these siren leaves will be reaching the 3rd tier." She stood up and walked over to me, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek. She looked older, more confident. The weight of the crown was gone, replaced by the simple, profound responsibility of a caretaker. "The matriarch wants to see you," she said. "She's offering you a permanent position as the High Warden of the Green. She says she'll pay you 300,000 marks a year, plus a private villa in the Sun Sector." I let out a low whistle. 300,000? That's a lot of credits for a guy who likes to play in the mud. "She knows your value, Case," Lyral said, her voice turning serious. "We all do. Without you, we would still be living in a world of glass and fear. You didn't just fix the garden. You fixed us." I looked around the thriving, singing arboretum. I looked at the children playing among the vines and the former soldiers learning the language of the roots. I felt a deep sense of pride, but also a strange, restless tug in my gut. I'm a gardener, Lyral, I said softly, and a gardener's job is to plant the seeds, not to own the forest. Aethelgard is healthy now. You don't need a high warden. You need each other. Her eyes widened. You're leaving? There are a lot of other gardens out there, kid, I said, leaning against the bonewood pillar. A lot of other worlds that are choking on their own shadows. A lot of other girls like Lily who are being told they're broken because they don't fit into a box. I think I've stayed in one place for too long. Lyral was quiet for a long moment. She didn't try to argue. She didn't try to guilt me into staying. She simply reached out and took my hand, her fingers interlocked with mine, just as they had been during the storm. I will miss you, Case, she whispered, but I understand. You are a sower of light. You cannot be contained by a single shell. I spent my final afternoon on Aethelgard doing exactly what I had done on my first day. I knelt in the dirt and worked. I pruned the dead wood, I watered the thirsty roots, and I talked to the plants. I told them about Earth, about the rain, and about a girl named Lily who loved yellow roses. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a long, amber light across the tiers, I stopped and looked back at the journey I had taken. For so long, I had viewed the world through the lens of a soldier. I saw problems to be solved, enemies to be defeated, and defects to be corrected. I thought that if something wasn't working perfectly, it was broken. I thought that if a person didn't speak, they were empty. I spent years trying to fix my sister, trying to fix myself, and eventually trying to fix a princess I didn't even know. But Aethelgard taught me that perfection is a lie told by people who are afraid of the dark. The most beautiful things in this galaxy aren't the ones that are flawless. They are the ones that have been broken and have found a way to grow back anyway. Lyral wasn't a weapon that needed to be armed, and she wasn't a patient that needed to be cured. She was a living soul who just needed to be heard in her own time. We spent 12 years trying to force her to speak our language, never realizing that she had been speaking a much deeper one all along. We were so busy trying to repair the surface that we ignored the roots. I realize now that my sister Lily wasn't a failure of my protection. Her silence wasn't a hole I had to fill with my own noise. It was a space she had created for herself in a world that didn't know how to be quiet. My job wasn't to pull her out of that space. It was to sit in it with her until she was ready to step out on her own. I learned that acceptance isn't about giving up. It's about making room. It's about understanding that the way someone else experiences the universe is just as valid as my own, even if I can't hear their voice. In the end, we aren't defined by our ability to follow the protocol or hit the targets. We are defined by the space we make for each other to breathe. I picked up my weathered kit bag and headed toward the transport shuttle. I didn't take any gold or titles with me. I just took my grandfather's shears and a small pouch of siren leaf seeds. I stopped at the edge of the docking bay and looked out at the vast, shimmering expanse of the Dyson Shell. I thought about all the people down there, the millions of lives that were finally free to be imperfect, to be quiet, and to be themselves. I wonder, how many times have you looked at someone, a friend, a stranger, or even yourself, and seen only a problem that needs fixing? How many times have you tried to repair a silence because it made you uncomfortable, or tried to force a flower to bloom before its time? I wonder what would happen if we all just stopped for a second, knelt in the dirt, and listened to the song that's already playing in the quiet spaces. I adjusted the strap of my bag and stepped onto the shuttle. The doors hissed shut, and the engines began to hum, a low melodic sound that reminded me of the garden. As the shuttle pulled away from Aethelgard, I looked out the viewport. The spire was a needle of green light against the darkness of the void, a beacon of hope for a galaxy that was finally learning how to grow. I sat back in my seat and closed my eyes. I didn't say a word. I just listened to the silence, and for the first time in my life, it sounded exactly like home. I pulled a single yellow rose from my pocket, one I had grafted myself, and placed it on the empty seat beside me. The ship hummed, the stars blurred into streaks of white, and I began the long journey toward the next garden.